Hi, it's Friday, February 5th, 2016. This is the third installment of the video substitution of our class meeting. I know this is taking a bit longer than I thought it would, but our class hour is almost 3 hours after all, so I'm just going to push through. We'll do this installment, and there'll be a fourth video just focused on the Marbury case, so I've decided to break it into two more segments. This is the third. And we left off on slide 27 of our PowerPoint, and on that slide are 5 points that outline the Anti-Federalist critique of the new proposed Constitution. And we left off, I reviewed point 1, the problematic legality of the convention and its work. I didn't talk much about why that idea is important in the future, after the founding. But at moments of key constitutional change, you see this idea of problematic legality operating. You see sort of institutionally irregular forms of action. Obviously, war is not politics as usual, but the process of adopting the Civil War amendments was somewhat irregular. And during the New Deal, there was an effort to gut the power of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stood in the way of constitutional change, striking down New Deal legislation, and Roosevelt proposed to pack the court with 6 additional justices, and then the court yielded. So that's another moment of, would a court packing plan, if Congress had passed it, be constitutional? Would it violate some idea of the separation of powers, and who the hell would decide that, right? So we want to keep our eye on that as we chart constitutional change. Turning to point 2 on the outline, I'm on slide 27 again. I left off saying the Anti-Federalists had a powerful objection to the notion of representation and the related idea of how extensive the territory would be if the 13 states were much more consolidated into one government and one union. So let me back up and make that point just so we can highlight what's going on in the Federalist with respect to this very theme. For the Anti-Federalist, representation itself is a compromise, right? So the ideal, what you would want to aim for would be you would be there yourself to govern yourself, right? That's a civic Republican ideal. And then a system of representation would have to be judged by how close it comes to that ideal. And they wanted, again, representation by people who were like the people being represented. They wanted the legislative body to be in proximity, to be close, so they could be observed. They wanted frequent elections, at least annual elections, right? So the shortest term under the new Constitution is 2 years. The senators would serve for 6 years, and the Anti-Federalists said that just points toward aristocracy. President's term is 4 years. Nobody's term limited. So they objected to the Constitution as a recipe for elite rule and a lack of democratic accountability, right? And as I think I indicated earlier, the Anti-Federalists had this saying, where annual elections end, tyranny begins, right? And similarly, and this is a related point, and they're linked in Madison's response as well, the Anti-Federalists objected to the idea that you could maintain a republic in a large territory. And here they had lots of tradition and existing political thought on their side. Madison's political thought is really revolutionary on this point. It's brand new. Probably the most well-known theorist that the Anti-Federalists would appeal to here would be Montesquieu, often referred to as the celebrated Montesquieu. But the idea was that if you have a republic where people participate in governing themselves, you need a small territory. People have to be pretty much alike. The population has to be homogeneous. Values and culture have to be reasonably similar. Otherwise, there's going to be too much factionalism, too much divisiveness to sustain a republic. And specifically, the Anti-Federalists said that if you have a large territory, right, you're likely to have these internal divisions. you're likely to have internal fractiousness, and you won't be able to have participation in government. There'll be too much diversity and too much polarization. A second point they made about the large territory, and some of these kind of resonate today if you think about it, even if a large republic isn't internally fractious, it's likely to be economically prosperous, and that leads to militarism and foreign entanglements, right? It brings on empire. An empire is not a republic, and that would be a great danger, and you tend to get a devolution into monarchy or dictatorship or some other form of government. And this is the most telling point they made, and it does reverberate through history, because there is a deficit in the Constitution in terms of linking ordinary people to the national government, right? And the Anti-Federalists were worried about this. They said, even if the large republic isn't internally fractious and isn't externally militaristic, this kind of large territory could not foster enough of a sense of civic virtue, of common citizenship, to sustain a republic. That nobody would have the experience of participating in public life and have the attachment to the public good that would be required. Participation in politics, and especially office holding, would be limited to a very small number of people, right? Madison might say, yeah, that's true, and it's a damn good thing too. That's kind of his response. But the fear was of an inert, passive, uninvolved population kind of cut off from a distant government, right? And so this was a system that was kind of designed with the preservation and promotion of privatism or selfishness even in mind. So let me just be a little briefer about the third, fourth, and fifth points on the outline. When the Anti-Federalists looked at the separation and blending of powers in the Constitution, they saw too much kind of blending of the more elite branches, right? The Senate and the presidency especially. There'd be a very small number of people in the Senate, and with the powers of the president and looking at the things that only the Senate and the president did, particularly foreign affairs and appointments, it looked like maybe aristocracy was on the table, right? That this would be another risk. When they looked at the Constitution and Article 3 and the role of the judiciary, they equally predicted, some of them wrote critiques along these lines, that the court would have a lot of leeway to say what the Constitution meant, and they would use that power to promote the power of the national government at the expense of the state level governments, and this was a bad thing. And they were right about that. I mean, Chief Justice Marshall will be doing that. They were not, maybe their fears were exaggerated in terms of the abolition of states, but that was another critique. And obviously they objected to the idea that these judges weren't answerable to anybody, right? They weren't elected. Once they were there was really no way to control them. And we'll look at Hamilton's response to that in 78, in Federalist number 78. Right. Finally, point 5, and this is what the Anti-Federalists are most known for. They are included among the founders because they said this document needed a Bill of Rights, that there were basic fundamental rights. They needed to be written down and entrenched, or else they were insecure. And for a while, the Federalists resisted that and wrote that it wasn't needed. Federalist number 84 makes that argument that it isn't needed. But they realized, the proponents realized that they'd have to compromise, and they always were willing to compromise. At the convention and thereafter, they were willing to make compromises if they could hold out the hope of getting the primary thing they wanted, which was a consolidated, stronger government. They agreed to add the Bill of Rights, and that was the price of ratification in key states. So the Anti-Federalists lost, but it was a pitched battle, and it was very close, and they got some major concessions. In Virginia, the vote was 10 by 10. It was out of 168 votes total. The proponents won that convention by 10 votes. In New York, the margin was 3 votes. So, and this The ratification process goes roughly December 1787 to June, July 1788. A few states agree to North Carolina, Rhode Island come later than that, but the government is set up, it's established. So, and another anti-federalist legacy that we could note is just that the point about the lack of anything linking ordinary people to the national government, and that has a lot to do with the emergence of the party system, the idea that political parties are actually not a necessary evil, as the framers thought, but actually a good thing, a thing that actually makes politics coherent and links people to politics. And that mass-based party system will emerge by the 1830s. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the Federalist response. And we have 3 Federalist papers out of 85. Most of these were written by Hamilton. John Jay wrote a few. James Madison wrote many, and the most important ones, probably. We're looking at 3, 10, 51, and 78, just to get a flavor, some sense of the backdrop. So in Federalist 10, we have Madison's response to the critique about representation and the extent of the territory, and he turns that argument against him around completely on its head. And he opens with something called the violence of factions, right? And I've put the definition of, I'm on slide 28 now, I've put the definition of faction on the slide, and I'll read it. By faction, I mean a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interest of the community as a whole. And he says that this is the main danger in a Republican government, and particularly majority faction. That if there's a threat to a Republican government, it is a majority faction taking over that will violate minority rights or take the country to hell based on passion or interest. We could call it mob rule, I guess. And then the essay goes on to talk about, what's the answer to that problem? That's a defect. Democracies almost inevitably fall into it, and republics do too. What's the answer? And that's what the essay is about. And he then says, well, we could eliminate the causes of faction. We could take away freedom, and then we wouldn't have to worry about it, but that would be kind of silly. Or we could try to give everyone the same sort of ideas and values and interests, and then there wouldn't be divisiveness. The sources of division are profound: class, property, religion, region, culture. But Madison says even if we didn't have important things to disagree about, we'd still have factions if we have freedom, right? That people's ideas or preferences kind of attach themselves to their own emotions. They become interested and self-interested, prone to bias and partisanship. We would make up reasons to fight. The causes of faction are sewn into the very nature of man, he says. And then he says the regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. You have to see it, acknowledge it, incorporate it, and check it through design. So if we can't eliminate the causes of faction, how do we control the effects? Then he says if it's a minority, if it's a numerical minority, the system overall is, at the end of the day, basically Republican. The majority can check a minority faction. But if it's a majority, that's the real danger, because a Republican government is based on the concept of popular sovereignty. And if the majority can form and be unimpeded, there's nothing that's going to stop it, right? And now his claim is the new constitutional design provides an answer to this. in two ways, and he has two prongs to his answer. Both prongs are set up by distinguishing between an extended republic and a pure democracy. Right? In a pure democracy, we all show up and we all make the decision ourselves. Madison believes that it won't be long before the majority oppresses the minority in that setting. In Federalist 55, he has this great line where he says, had every Athenian assembly had every member of an Athenian assembly been a Socrates, a lover of truth, a philosopher, every assembly still would have been a mob. But in a large or great republic, there's a scheme of representation where most of us pick a few people to do the everyday, ordinary governing, right? And those people are probably going to be the better sorts of people, and they're going to make better decisions. They're accountable, but they're kind of delegated an enormous amount of authority for the day-to-day operations of the government. He says this will refine and enlarge the public views. So the image of representation that emerges here is not of a mirror of the people, an exact portrait of the people, but rather a filtering of raw passions and interests into something more reasonable and rational, right? Refine and enlarge. Second difference between a pure democracy and a large republic is that a large republic takes in a greater diversity of interests. And it's almost like, a vector sum idea where competing forces have to meet and compromise and cancel each other out, right? More interests of different kinds make it less likely that an overbearing and coherent ideological majority can form. And even if it forms, it won't be able to work its will over a larger territory with more area and institutions to conquer. So I think one question we can ask, should ask, is as you read the definition on slide 28, does that definition make any sense? Does it have any content? Is it purely formal? What's a faction? Well, a faction is a group, could be a minority. He's worried about a majority faction that opposes the rights of others. We could give that some meaning. I think he would agree that a majority that took away people's property rights would be an interested and overbearing majority violating people's rights. We can give that some content. What about the permanent and aggregate interest of the community as a whole? Aren't we going to disagree about that very question? What to me is public regarding action is to you factional behavior. Well, how do we know? Or to put the question more pointedly, if this is a system designed to prevent a bad majority from taking over, why doesn't it also then prevent a good majority from taking over? Isn't it simply a recipe for elite rule, which can be good or bad? But I don't get it, right? What kind of definition is this, and how are we going to know, and who's going to say? I think Madison has an answer to that. I think he would want to distinguish between majority faction as a kind of an unfiltered, direct democracy kind of impassioned movement, and majority rule as the result of what comes out of the complicated process of different constituencies being represented in different ways in different institutions, with these elites having some insulation to fight it out and deliberate and work out some good result. I mean, I think he does have an answer to that, but it is a good question whether that definition amounts to anything. When we turn to Federalist, I'm going to move to slide 29 now. When we turn to Federalist 51, Madison is explaining and defending how the Constitution deals with the problem of separation of powers. And if you're only reading 51 and you haven't read the other Federalist papers, you might have wondered about the first sentence of the essay. It begins, "To what expedient then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution?" yeah, you are coming in the middle of an argument, right? He in 47 and 48 and 49 and 50, he's been discussing this problem. Basically, simply, it's how do you maintain in practice a division of power when we know, or he knows, that writing it down on paper won't do. In practice, power wants more power. People with power take more power. How are we going to keep power separated? And liberty depends on that. And he's already argued that we can't take every dispute about which branch has what powers to the people. That would cause too much instability. Right? Jefferson is more sort of open to that kind of answer. Every generation should have a big public battle. Madison wants more stability, continuity, order, rationality. And his argument is that by institutional design, by incorporating ambition into the very operation of government, expecting self-interested perspectives and maintaining, some degree of power in the actual operation of the institutions, the separation of powers can be maintained. But you can follow his logic here. What's the most dangerous branch? What's the branch with the most power? The legislative branch. So what do we do right away? We break it up. We break it into two houses. So by this design, nothing gets done unless each branch acts independently, and they're differently constituted. But to legislate, they have to independently arrive at an answer, and they're not done. It goes to the president, who has a qualified veto. The framers toyed with an absolute veto, but a qualified veto is strong enough. The president vetoes, and then the veto can be overridden by two-thirds vote in each house. Then Madison goes on to talk about federalism and the security we get from dividing power between one national and several state governments. This is the compound republic. It's partly national, it's partly federal, and this provides a double security. And then at the end of 51, he returns to the themes of Federalist 10, and this is an elaborate sort of, one gets a mechanical imagery of the institutions functioning together, laid over a society with many different interests and values. So no interested and overbearing majority will form or be able to take power. It's interesting that he doesn't talk about the courts here. One might expect that he would. We've come to think about the courts as part of this system of power checking power. I don't think he foresaw that to the extent that Hamilton did. But if you take 10 and 51 together, you get a proliferation of the organizational forms of representation in government, a fragmentation of governmental power. Different people have power from different sources. The House is selected one way, the Senate another, the President a third. The courts can claim popular authority if they speak for the people's fundamental values as embodied in the Constitution. So everybody can claim to speak in some sense for the people or some of the people, but no one can act alone or even hope to act alone. Makes it hard to get things done, but that's the whole point. Turning to Federalist number 78, this is kind of a fascinating essay to play with. We see a lot of the themes that Hamilton writes about the judiciary in Federalist 78. We see these themes repeated in Marshall's opinion in Marbury. Hamilton's response to the anti-federalists who feared the courts was that the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch. I mean, that sounds kind of strange to us now, right? We don't think of the courts as least dangerous. If dangerous is another word for powerful, we know that our courts have tremendous power. And they interpret the Constitution. People defer to their interpretation of what the Constitution means. They have power to interpret and shape law, regular lawmaking. How could he say the judiciary will be the least dangerous branch? Well, it is a point that is still kind of relevant if we're thinking about the court and its work. about institutional power. So he says the courts don't have the power to tax and spend, and they don't control the force, right? So if their decisions are to be enforced, other actors in the system have to be willing to do that. Well, why would they be willing to do it, and what would make them do it? So you don't have to fear the fact that they're going to be reading the Constitution for meaning. And he's pretty clear that he expects the court to do that in a case, to regard the Constitution as law, to prefer the Constitution to the ordinary statute. Just because he says it doesn't mean that most other people agreed with it or believed it. Most didn't when he wrote this. But he also talks in the essay about the importance of judicial independence, this is an early instance of what we'll see in Marbury, and it's often overlooked in Marbury, but what Marshall's trying to do is draw a boundary between the legal and the political, right? To establish by words a sphere of law that will be for courts, and separate that from the political, where the court really has nothing to say, or little to say. But because the courts are the weakest, they have to be fortified. Just like the legislative branch is naturally the strongest in a system based on popular sovereignty and popular support and popularity, the courts will be the weakest. And the fortification is this staffing by professionals for life, right? They serve during good behavior. That independence from political passions and political interests and electoral accountability, that's essential to the court performing its function of speaking for the law and protecting rights. So what about the fact that, we're going to disagree about what the Constitution means? How does Hamilton respond to that, right? Well, like Marshall, he often seems to indicate that the text of the Constitution has reasonably clear meaning, and, is that a satisfying answer or not? Okay, I'm 27 minutes into this one, and the next video will be probably about 25 minutes, and it will give us the political context and a textual review and discussion of Marbury v. Madison. Thanks.